book of Lamentations allows people to express their doubtful feelings, which can be seen in the interplay of themes between sin, punishment, and confession. Let's take a look at the first theme, sin in Lamentations. In Lamentations, 16 verses refer to sin. Among these, chapter 1, 22, chapter 3, 64, and chapter 4, 22 refer to the sins of Jerusalem's enemies, whereas the remaining 13 references relate to the sins of Jerusalem and the people. Gospel comments as to the specific sins which constitute the great iniquity of Judah. We are surprised that more detail is not given, though since it's undeniable, no specific sin is mentioned in Lamentations. Then the second theme, punishment in Lamentations. The overwhelming majority of Lamentations contains images of suffering, which significantly play down the sin theme. Some scholars understand Judah's suffering as the deserved consequence of Yahweh's just punishment. But Dobbs also rightly suggests that the sin of Judah is not equal to her suffering, which can be seen as follows. First of all, Yahweh appears to be the brutal agent of Jerusalem's punishment, who is ultimately responsible for the destruction. God is portrayed as perpetrator of violence in Lamentation chapter 1, 12 to 15, chapter 2, 1 to 9, and chapter 3, 1 to 18, where active verbs of violence are attributed to Yahweh. Secondly, Yahweh is compared to a fierce hunter stalking and ensnaring his people, a preying bear and lion lying in ambush, and an archer stringing his bow against the victims. Thirdly, in his wrath, Yahweh dismantles Zion by destroying her military bases, eradicating all means of access to God, demolishing the city structures, executing and taking political and religious leaders into exile. Fourthly, Dobbs also states the absence of Yahweh is as oppressive as was his hostile presence. This absence is most effectively communicated through the deity's silence. Yahweh is not given a voice in Lamentations. God is relentlessly requested to look and see Zion's suffering, as God is questioned whether he sees his people's plight. The poet also finds his pleas unheard by God. In addition, the refrain, "There is no comforter for her," is repeated 5 times in the book. God's silence in terms of not seeing, not hearing, and not comforting is a harsh punishment for his people. Fifthly, the scale of Yahweh's punishment can be seen through the description of the victim's suffering. Jerusalem is personified as daughter Zion. She was once a princess, but is now a widow and a slave who suffers invasion, exile, hard servitude, starvation, mocking, and betrayal by her lovers and friends. Most insulting of all, she is humiliated by sexual violence. Her nakedness exposed to the nations implies the foreign invaders entering her sanctuary. The plight of such a victimized woman calls forth empathy from any onlooker. Daughter Zion is a mother grieving for her children. She stands in solidarity with all devastated mothers, whom she represents. The picture of starving infants slowly dying in their mother's arms elicits the empathetic tears of the narrator. Most distressing of all is the image of mothers eating their children as food. The starvation of children and the cannibalism of these young victims raise the question about the rightness of Yahweh's wrath. His punishment appears to be completely out of proportion. Finally, Yahweh's utter lack of compassion is highlighted by the fourfold repetition of has shown no mercy. It demonstrates the poet's real struggle of faith in face of God's excessive brutality. The third theme, confession in Lamentations. Brief confessions are evident in Lamentations, but Zion's brief confession of guilt simply gives way to further extended expressions of affliction, grief, and challenge to God. These confessions are effectively dismantled by the preceding and the subsequent accusations against God. Lineville claims, yet rather than making her sins the primary concern of her speeches, she admits them flatly and not altogether wholeheartedly. It begs the question about the genuineness of the poet's confessions in the light of Yahweh's excessive cruelty. Take chapter 5 as an example. Jerusalem once again acknowledges her guilt. We have sinned. However, she points out that it is the sin of her ancestors that leads to the present generation's misery. Our ancestors sinned, they are no more, and we bear their iniquities. In chapter 5, verse 7. Jerusalem's vague confession in 5:16, which seems to be contradictory to the preceding complaint in 5:7, is now overturned by the subsequent protest in 5:20. Why have you forgotten us completely? Why have you forsaken us these many days? After all, there is no evidence of reaching reconciliation with God. In the final two verses, the communal plea for restoration in the end casts some doubt on whether Yahweh's anger is limitless, and he has utterly rejected them. The book ends on the highest note of doubt and protest. In conclusion, the first 4 chapters of Lamentations are expressed in acrostic form, in which the lines follow the Hebrew alphabetical order, expressing the sense of wholeness and completeness of their grief. Eventually, the acrostic form breaks down in the final poem in chapter 5. The 22-verse length remains, so that the acrostic is shadowed here. The form finally allows the doubt to be expressed implicitly. It allows people to express their doubtful feelings that they may not even dare to put into words. Its power is to penetrate into the depths of the most disturbed soul, expressing the most inexpressible and unspeakable grief. Yet it will not force faith.